Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Kurt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Good.
Welcome, friends, to episode 14 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm back here with Kurt and Jerry today, talking about one of the more powerful concepts of trauma, and that's the concept of dissociation. And so we've titled this one, I think the title is great. Kurt came up with it, putting things together to understand, quote unquote, coming apart. And I think that's we're going to explore that in the next hour or so and really start to understand how, again, as we've talked about throughout, kind of a survival technique for a lot of folks can really have some long-term consequences when we talk about having an integrative whole story of ourselves and the world around us. So we're going to explore this really complex topic today and see where we go with that. But as always, we start out every week with bright, shiny objects. And so, Kurt, I'm going to start with you this week. What are you thinking about, my friend?
I was watching a whole bunch of videos and reading some articles. I can't remember what I was preparing for at this point. And I came across this great video that showed, if you remember, Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers. And he had to do a Senate testimony before a budget committee in 1969 because funding was going to get cut for public television. So they had Fred Rogers come on and talk about his show to what appears to be this very angry congressman. And he was so calm and he was so kind and he just he talked so well. It was fun to watch this congressman shift his entire interactional style with Mr. Rogers, surprisingly, right? And it was really cool to see how Fred Rogers' state started to become contagious to this congressman. And so Fred Rogers said a phrase that I just loved it, and I thought, I want to remember this. And he said that one of the major goals for him on his show was to teach children that feelings are both mentionable and manageable. And I thought that was really cool that he had said that. And I think that was really kind of the point at which this congressman really turned 180 degrees. And at one point in the interview, the congressman looked at him and he goes, "Well, this is the first time in 3 days that I've had goosebumps. It looks like you just earned your $20 million. It was a great interview. So if you get a chance to see it, I'm sure it's on YouTube, but it was about 7 minutes long. It's really wonderful to watch.
That's great. Can't have too much Mr. Rogers in your life regardless. So I know I spent many hours with him growing up. So very cool. Jerry, what are you thinking about this week?
You know, I was at I took my grandkids to the Parade of Lights this weekend. And there were a number of things that I observed that really were, one is how we as a species could put that many of us in a small area and we get along, it's amazing, right? It's like if you just stuck a group of chimpanzees on the street, they would be fighting and doing it, right? So that was really nice. But the other thing that I observed was while we were there, there were police cars with armed police officers with machine guns that would go up and down, and police dogs that were smelling for bombs along the way. And those experiences would intrude into you. You'd see that and then you'd kind of go, oh my God, we're in a crowd. This is a potential dangerous place.
Yeah.
But then you would it would pass and you'd go back to enjoying the experience. And you know, our ability to, in some ways, disconnect from that fear and anxiety and get back to this enjoyable experience. But really, because of the events that have happened along the way, it's changed somewhat how parades and large get-togethers happen, right? And the kids were just having a great time. They were running. They seemed somewhat oblivious, but it was very clear from the adults in the crowd that safety was a different kind of issue to kind of manage that. So I think as a society, where it was really nice to see that we're still putting ourselves and our children in places that they can have fun and have imagination and get excited. But at the same time of this ever-present anxiety about something could go wrong is there with all of us. So it was a nice kind of way to see how we're managing these kind of issues as a society and in some ways moving forward, but with also developing some habits about how we keep ourselves safe that weren't there before. So it was Dr. Jerry goes to the parade. Very different.
And doesn't get arrested, which is good. Don't worry about that. Awesome. So my bright shining object of the week is I've been watching. There's been a few things that she has put out, Elizabeth Smart, recently, documentaries and interviews that she's done, and she kind of made my radar. Basically, 2 years ago, we spoke at a conference, though she was day one and I was day two, so I didn't get to hear her speak, but I thought it was interesting as somebody and who I hadn't heard the name Elizabeth Smart in maybe a decade or so, and so to see her name pop up on a conference schedule, I was like, oh yeah, I remember. I think she's just a few years younger than I am, so that was something that I remembered way back when, and I thought it was interesting that she was telling her story, and so when the documentary and interview came out, I watched it, and I thought it was a pretty powerful example of trauma, because according to her, and it seems like everything backs this up, is that she was in a really healthy, loving family. She seemed to love her brothers and sisters, mom and dad, seemed an extended family as well, aunts, uncles, all really created this great family unit, both before her horrific events of 9 months of just hell, and then afterwards, she had that intact family system. So it's one of those occasions where I think in my career, I've worked so much with kids that, had been in family dysfunctions or other things, for most of their entire life at times, or at least for years at a time, a very sort of a different type and powerful experience of trauma. And I think there's a lot in her story that really informs us. And I think one of the main takeaways that I get from this, and I remember when I flash back to myself, 20 plus years ago when this happened, or even more than that, at this point, 25 or so years, I was like, well, why didn't she just yell out to say, hey, I'm Elizabeth Smart, help me? Because she had the opportunity actually to do that with police at times. And, it just was a real reminder of where I was before all this information, and understanding that, from that outside perspective, we have to be very careful, because of course that's what I would have done in that situation. Yet I haven't had the months of experiences she had leading up to that very survival state that she was in. And so I think just want to give her a lot of props for coming out, telling her story, really making a mission out of this now to help survivors of kidnappings and other extreme sexual assault situations. So really cool to see how she's transformed that horrific experience into a mission for her, and taking that, I think, as we talk about integration and dissociation, she took the worst part of her life, and I think luckily something most of us will never have to experience anything close to that intensity, and has really made it now a mission to do good in the world. And it seems like she's in a happy marriage, has some kids of her own. So just kind of cool to see someone who I hadn't thought about for decades come back and tell her story in a powerful way. And I want to turn it over to Kurt here to introduce the topic in more detail today, but I pulled something out of her interview, Elizabeth Smart's interview, that I thought at least gave us a good transition into this topic. And she's describing how, and if you're not familiar with her story, basically, and this is just horrible to feel come out of your mouth, she basically was in captivity for 9 months and pretty much got sexually and emotionally and at times physically abused on a daily basis. And so the interviewer asked how she really was able to survive that experience. And her quote really stuck me as a good way to sort of introduce the topic of dissociation. She said it was almost like an emotional disconnect. And I love this next thing. It was like pulling a cord out of a plug. It felt like the part of me that feels, that has emotions, just shut down. She says, in order to survive and keep my sanity, I had not to feel. And I thought it was just a powerful, and I cannot do it justice. If you see her say this, it's also a very powerful thing, because she's kind of feeling all this coming up as well. So with that sort of our soft introduction, Kurt, I'll turn it over to you to start our discussion on this important topic.
Well, you're taking a little risk there, letting the behavioral guy talk about
dissociation. I know. You've done it. You're pretty good at it, though. I know it's going to be well structured. That's the good thing.
I watched those productions about Elizabeth Smart as well a couple of weeks ago. Absolutely fascinating. Mm-hmm. And I had two kind of thoughts as I watched them. And one, you mentioned them both, Matt. One was the incredible amount of family support that she had after she came home. And what struck me was how critical that was to her recovery. Yeah. And that she could come into a really very socially engaging, very socially supportive family environment, and could at least have the opportunity to reestablish a sense of safety in a really fundamental way. So that struck me a lot. Another thing that struck me were comments that she had made, like the ones that you just read, about how she disconnected from the experience, both in it and at times still does.
Yeah. And
that got me, of course, thinking about dissociation. And one kind of statement about dissociation, and many things about, as we think about trauma and the impacts of the brain, and that the brain has parts of it that both cause problems for us because of the functions, and those functions keep us safe. Yeah. And dissociation really falls into one of those. That essentially our brains are processing so much information at any given point in time, we can't pay attention to it all. And we apply selective filters to it. And that in itself is a form of dissociation. Shifting our attention to what we find important is a form of dissociation. And anything then I got all these neural systems that are integrating and keeping track of all this information from millions of neurons. And sometimes, even under optimal circumstances, we can't create a coherent picture out of that. And anything that gets in the way of those neurons firing in association with each other can cause problems with creating a coherent sense of a whole. Yeah. One of those things that is really important for us is, and this may be one of the things that is unique to human beings, is that we're able to contemplate our own existence. And in many areas, we're finding there are other animals that can do kind of close to that, but not all the way there. But clearly we can do it, and we do it a lot. Yeah. So that's one of the things that is really an important part that emerges from all of this brain activity, is a sense of not just how environmental events are associated with each other, but how our presence is associated with those events. Yeah. And that we become a part of that picture, and the brain itself contemplates how it is associated with all of those events. And sometimes that goes wrong. And when trauma happens, it's very likely that will go wrong, because it gets in the way of these neurons firing in us creating associations with them. One of the memory episodes is probably one of the most prevalent ways of talking about that, where we get memories that happen that aren't given a context to them, things that aren't explicit memories and only implicit memories. So that was a lot of the thoughts I had. I thought you're bringing in Elizabeth Smart was a surprise to me, actually, that you had watched that. But I think it's a great way to bring in this idea of dissociation. I've talked to many people over the years, and I'm thinking of some very close friends that I have who've been through horrific life experiences. And part of the thing that allows them to have survived that and to start becoming very high functioning human beings is their ability to disconnect from what they have been through.
Yeah.
So it becomes very much a part of what creates their success later, but it also is the side of it that is hard to integrate and create new meaning around those traumatic experiences. So it really is one of those balancing acts, you know, that we find over and over again. The things that make you really good at certain things are the things that also hold you back from being good at other things.
Absolutely.
And dissociation is one of those.
Very cool.
Those are some of my initial thoughts
Awesome.
about that. Jerry, did I hit the kind of the neurobiological highlights of that? Anything that you would add to our understanding of how
I think you did a
happens?
really nice job for a behaviorist of talking about all that stuff.
It's
I'm
a kid,
I'm
baby. It's a
handicapped.
kid.
I'm handicapped.
So I think without getting too complex is you mentioned this concept of attention, right? And so in one aspect, our brains are able to process information that we're paying attention to. But there's other parts of our brain, our lower parts of our brain, that actually process information when we're not paying attention. And so they're being encoded in sensations, they're being encoded in images, they're being encoded in feelings, they're being encoded in behavioral patterns, but there's not an integrated narrative that goes along with those experiences, right? And we know that for infants and toddlers, that capacity to create this narrative is not present yet. So it's being embedded in their biology earlier, and then later as they get more mature, their brain matures, they have the capacity to create these explicit memories. What we also know is that when people are in situations that are overwhelming, that they feel helpless and powerless, that this style of coping where I divide my attention. So in this example, we heard a woman who found a strategy. She said, I unplugged my feelings. I unplugged from those experiences. Well, in some ways, those weren't being downloaded into memories that have the integration of sensations and feelings. And so it protected her, but she was also recording that at a different level. So she has memories, she has experiences, but she may not have words. So she may be able to talk about some experiences, but be very disconnected from the emotions related to that. Or she may have the emotions and get disconnected from the knowledge of the experience because she really was disconnected. And so if you could imagine being in those experiences, the impact it has on your developing sense of self, which leads to this concept of this fragmented part of ourselves, that we all have different parts of ourselves. But there's this integrated I in there that you have a narrative that connects all this. So when I go to work, I'm in a different social context. I act differently. I come home. My wife knows me in a different context. My kids know me in a different context. But there's an integration of that. But for many individuals who have experienced overwhelming traumatic experiences, and they've had to develop strategies to survive and minimize really actual threat and danger, their ability to integrate that into this coherent narrative is really challenged. So, I think what we kind of look at is take from this kind of healthy dissociation that we all get, where we're daydreaming, we're disconnecting, we're processing, to these extremes where we're in situations that are overwhelming, where my safety and protection and survival depend on me disconnecting. It is really this concept of fragmentation. So this individual may have, what happened to the part of her that wanted, as Matt, you said, is if it was me, I would have got up and started screaming and yelling and telling people, I'm being held captive. Well, that part of her, that fight part of her had to be dissociated. For her to express that piece of herself really would have resulted in maybe some real danger to herself. So she disconnected that piece of herself. So when she needed it, it wasn't present.
Yeah.
Right? To kind of look at that piece, but it doesn't go away. So at times she could, maybe when there were kind of non-threatening places, she could scream and get angry about something, but at other times she couldn't connect with that part of herself.
Yeah.
Or the part of herself that wanted to avoid and disappear, or the part of herself that becomes submissive and wants to be compliant as a way to survive. All of those part of us, we have all those, as you would talk about in our behavioral repertoire, but they're integrated. For individuals who are traumatized, you may be dealing with their fight self while the part of the other pieces isn't present. So I think that when we look at that model we're creating, is really understand this fragmentation of self and others becomes a really important component. I'm working with an individual who told me, I can't trust my body to do the right thing. And I can't trust my mind to make the right decision about what my body's doing. Really, she's not integrated. And so, her ability to talk about this now is beginning to have the process of integration, but to grow up in a world where your body becomes a dangerous neighborhood to visit, you have to disconnect from it.
Yeah, that's powerful.
So I think you've done a really good job of kind of highlighting that, but I don't want to lose this subjective experience that many of the people we deal with walk around feeling so disconnected from themselves and others.
Yeah.
One of the things I see at even a lower level, not even driven by early traumatic experience, but for people in general, is when people make the transition, and I myself struggled with this, as I made a transition from being at one level of an organization to the next higher up in the organizational hierarchy, where you have to start making decisions about other people. That becomes really challenging. And one of the first things, and I still hear this a lot, and Matt, I'd love to hear your take on this too, from the amount of time that you spend around the country talking to people from across such a great swath of the population. I hear people say, when they have to make difficult decisions, they hear them say the words, I don't care. That I don't care what people think of me. I have to make this hard decision. I remember saying that as a young leader. It took me a couple of years where I thought, that's not true. I'm really kind of lying to myself, which is a form of me dissociating from the difficulty of the decision.
Yeah.
That it was hard for me to see myself as a person making this decision. And I had to change what I said to myself, which was, I care deeply.
Yeah.
I just can't let that be the only thing that drives me.
Yeah.
They have to incorporate other types of information and other perspectives into this decision. But I care deeply about what other people think of me. And I care deeply about what decision I make that may affect them. And I thought that was, for me, that was a great personal example, and one that I see repeated over and over and over.
Yeah.
every consult I'm in, every meeting I'm in, I hear those things getting said.
Yeah. Well, I think you bring out a real big challenge, just to kind of touch on it of how the exposure to trauma that we experience, it's hard for us. And I think whether you're in a leadership position, or I see this a lot with direct care folks as well, when I have to hear stories over and over again about sexual abuse, about homelessness, about addiction, about domestic violence, I see a lot of people have a very similar response, is how do I care deeply about each and every one of those situations when I know tomorrow I'm going to have to hear 5 more stories that are just as intense. And I think anytime we're exposed to that hardship, and I think one of the hardest things in my entire career, even though I've listened to a lot of people tell their traumatic stories, is from that leader position, letting somebody go. In other words, firing somebody, to say it bluntly. And, you know, it's easy, I think, and it's that natural reaction. And not that anything in my life I've experienced I would ever compare to what Elizabeth Smart went through, but we do that on a scale of levels. It's sometimes, you know, you look at all the studies about, you know, how did people working in concentration camps follow orders? You know, we'd like to say that none of us. You know, you ask 10 people on the street, would you have followed orders and done this? 10 people would say no, yet we know all 10 of those people probably would have followed orders in that situation. And so we disconnect, we justify. You know, it kind of reminds me of some of those Freudian coping skills that we learned way back in like psychology 101, like justification and intellectualization and all of those pieces that we do to really defend ourselves from hurt. And at the extreme level, one of the analogies I use, I think, to kind of bring together what both of you have been talking about, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, is especially in situations that I have seen in my experience and the research that I've read. And again, I think we didn't title this the Elizabeth Smart podcast, but I think, again, she gives us a really great example of what I see a lot of times with severe dissociation. So when people have trouble maybe connecting to reality, a lot of times, is that these folks have been in positions for extended period of time where they don't have the economic, social, or physical ability to fight back or run away. So in some ways, those first two responses, so again, Elizabeth Smart, with telling her story, gives us a great example. She was actually chained. She couldn't run away. And she was a 14-year-old girl going against grown adults, one of them being a male. So she couldn't really fight back in any meaningful way. And what I have seen in my experience, especially with those severe trauma cases, is when you can't do anything else, again, all you've sort of got left as a coping skill is to unplug. And I think if you have, what I see is if you have to do this on a regular basis, I like to think about someone with a fairly intact, integrated, as Jerry would say, personality. I like to think about it kind of as a mirror. And we all sort of have chips in our mirror, and we have different sections of our mirror, which sort of represents our personality. So like Jerry said, though I can't imagine Jerry being any different no matter what situation he's in, but supposedly he changes. But, you know, you see me presenting in front of 100 people. I'm one guy, like Jerry said. If I'm out at a concert, I'm a different guy. But the thing is, like, I may be on different parts of my mirror playing different roles, expressing different parts of my personality. But if you met me as a keynote speaker and then you meet me as a drive-by trucker fan at my favorite band watching them perform in concert, I may be dressed different. I may be attempting to dance at the concert, kind of acting the fool a little bit. But if we had a conversation during the concert, you would still connect, oh, this is the Matt I met who did the keynote address. And I think what I've seen with the folks, and I've working with highly traumatized populations who couldn't run away or fight back, it's in many ways kind of dropping that mirror or that glass, and it's shattering sometimes, not into a million pieces, but just like different kind of slivers of a pie. And what I've seen is when people get triggered, they seem to go into different pieces of this pie. And one of the things I've always been fascinated with from the psychological perspective is, and I've seen this with a small minority of cases I've worked with, is in some situations you get a whole different personality showing up when they get triggered. And I just kind of wanted to throw out, if we think, I'd love to see what you thought about the analogy to begin with, but if we think about severe complex trauma shattering in some ways the coherence of our personality, what is the functional part of the brain that sometimes shifts into very different personality characteristics under certain types of pressure? And I'd love to get your guys' thinking and experience that you've seen in your clinical work as well around that.
Good question, Matt.
That is a big question. That's making me think a
Big
lot.
question. You know, what was making me think before we get into the question you asked is, Kurt, you'll remember I went into a treatment center to begin to help them understand trauma and dissociation. And one of the first comments was, we don't have a lot of dissociation going on.
Yeah.
Right? Which means they were dissociated from the dissociation, right? It's like, we don't pay attention to that aspect of it.
Yeah.
And so I think what you've described is this individual being in front of me, being completely different, in a different aspect of himself, not integrated. Think about the individual dealing with that, is that would be very disorganizing. So I tend to integrate it for you and think the reason you're acting this way is because you're not motivated or you're not, right? As I try to start making explanations if I don't have an understanding of this process of dissociation. And you know, you're being oppositional, or you have an attention deficit problem and you're not motivated. All of these are explanations as opposed to, I'm dealing with a very different state of you today.
Yeah.
Right? So I think this concept today, this podcast really is helping people understand is that one is that dissociation is a strategy to minimize injury and threats, right? And so when you're in a situation that you perceive danger or threat or being triggered, you in some ways bring out a part of you that has to cope with this situation to protect other pieces of yourself.
Yeah.
Right? So in a way, me getting angry and screaming at you and you're seeing the part of me that's disconnected, is that part of me protected the little vulnerable piece of me at some other point?
Yeah.
So it served a very important part, but it's not integrated. But it serves each of the pieces that people bring to the therapy process or to the experience has a very important survival piece. Mm-hmm. And so helping people kind of reintegrate that and own it, and in some ways asking them in a way for you is, how did you being so angry and fighting and resistant keep you safe at some point in your life?
Yeah. Right?
As opposed to, I need to start controlling that part of you because you're creating anxiety in me. So I think that when you see individuals who, one is you change the lens in which you see them, is that I'm seeing this is a piece of you that you're bringing to this interaction that you feel is important for your survival at the moment. Mm-hmm. And I need to welcome that piece of you, not necessarily control it or get it away. But the other piece is for that individual who's dealing with it is begin to help them embrace that piece as well. And sometimes these pieces, there's not conscious awareness of them.
Yeah.
So you see it come out in body posture, right? So I'm submissive now, or my shoulders are over now, as opposed to I'm standing up and being assertive. So is that really some of the body work, that we look at from Pat Ogden, and from where we're really looking at gestures and physical kind of doing, is this memories caught in the body that they don't have the capacity to be integrated into a narrative. Mm-hmm. So I think that this concept that Kurt did such a nice job of kind of helping us see is now bringing that to our interactions with our clients. Is instead of why didn't you yell that day when you were being held captive? Really, what was that like for you not to be able to tell people that you were being hurt? Yeah. Right? What was that like? What was that? Because for me I would wonder, if I can't scream and I can't tell people and there's police there, then there's a sense of shame that goes along with that. Why didn't I do what I needed to do to protect myself?
Yeah.
When our clients understand this concept, it helps them to understand that they did what they needed to do to survive in the moment.
Yeah.
One of the
Kurt, I
things
want to hear this from the behavioral perspective, my man. So much, because again, how would you, when you see someone shift in this way, again, you know, and I put all my stereotypes of behavioralists on you because I do that every episode. How do you start to make sense of something that may make no logical sense, kind of, at least initially, to an outsider? How do you, from that very concrete perspective that you bring, sort of start to construct a conceptualization of what's going on with somebody?
I think that situation where you've got such extreme vacillation between even overly compliant to oppositional.
Yeah.
And that fragmentation is one of the hardest things for parents, caregivers, direct care staff. That is the hardest thing for them that I've heard for them to deal with. They could handle aggression all day long if that's all they had to deal with. Yeah. Great, we can create systems around that. We can create safety around that. But when it vacillates from one day, you're incredibly compliant, you're incredibly pleasant, you don't cause any problems for me if I'm a teacher in a classroom or I'm a parent who's got 3 other kids to deal with. We've got to have some organized effort here to get all of this happening.
Yep.
And when you vacillate between these two extremes, it's real hard to create predictability around that for the caregivers or for the parents, for the teacher, for the staff, for the therapist.
Yeah.
So I think certainly one of the things I've thought recently and over the last several years is, from an organizational standpoint, how much care and attention all of our direct care staff need and all of our parents need to be able to deal with that kind of an environment. And the best thing that I found to be able to do in one sense is to teach them a different lens to view that behavior through, to teach them this, to teach them that they are dealing with that person in a different state today than it was yesterday. And even that kind of reframe, it can help a lot. Yeah, because you can't if you try and make explanations for like, well, we just need to clamp down harder or we just need to be more permissive, neither one of those extremes is really the right answer. You want to be somewhere in the middle between those things most of the time. So those are some of the thoughts that I have around that. And certainly one of the things that I've seen as the most kind of prevalent form of dissociation is what I would hear people talk about as a lack of motivation. Mm-hmm. That like a teacher can't get a child to engage in schoolwork or can't get a child to do whatever the teacher wants him or her to do. And that can really be a disconnection between what's going on in the environment and what this child is actually experiencing. Probably one of the most common forms of dissociation that I see. As can being overly compliant. That can be equally as dissociative, but it doesn't tend to happen quite as much.
Yeah.
So creating plans around either of those two things, at least it gives you something to be predictable, right? If you can create some predictability, you certainly can help people to understand that the fluctuation is going to be predictable. Yeah. That you can expect that one day you may get extreme compliance and the next day you may get extreme opposition. At least that much is predictable. And then we can create plans around those things. And certainly from a theoretical standpoint, some of the things that have been a part of applied behavior analysis and behavioral therapies for a long time are called relational frame theory and acceptance and commitment therapy. And those come from an understanding of how relational frames can become part of what guides our behavior. And those were very much developed in outside the skin kinds of understandings. And then that was Steve Hayes and Linda Hayes really kind of got into that, where those are some really powerful theoretical and philosophical understandings that are becoming much more, I think, prevalent and understood by the behavioral world, and are wonderful, wonderful things.
Yeah.
So Matt, I have a question for you.
All right.
Right? So here's the question. When we're talking today about fragmentation and this disconnect, and you think about motivational interviewing and helping people kind of look at their ambivalence on that not necessarily well integrated. How do you see some of the approach that motivational interviewing takes to help people in some ways to hope maybe different parts of themselves?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question. And, oh, by the way, why I wrote the book, Connecting Paradigms, a neurobiological.
I thought that might come out at that moment.
Just in case you need a last-minute Christmas gift. Thank you, Jerry. But I think that's an important question. I think it goes with what Kurt says as well is, you know, motivational interviewing gives you a lot of great skill sets on active listening skills, building the relationship. We talked about the attunement process that's so important for all of this. So if somebody who is sort of new to MI would come to say, hey, you know, I listened to your podcast. We've got 3 people in our classroom who's dissociating, we think, on a regular basis. How do I, and I love this term, MI them. I love it when it becomes a verb. I'd probably say don't, to be honest with you. I wouldn't, if you're having that trouble sort of integrating your reality into your experience, and whether that looks like checking out in the back of the classroom or whether that looks like really disruptive, illogical behaviors, you know, and I kind of mentioned this in Connecting Paradigms, you know, it's really about where I would start is helping them reconstruct their story of themselves, their personal narratives. I'd really probably, honestly, if they identify dissociation, probably getting them a higher level psych evaluation would be one of my first assessments, but really building that relationship, having them, and again, I'd really want none of these answers are simple, like, hey, reflect their ambivalence, and that should really integrate their personality. But I'd probably want to really start on the psychological aspect of it, because I think what looks like a lack of motivation is actually an inability to integrate reality. And again, that's where an MI is, you know, a great tool to talk to people about change. But I think we often jump to, this is our one skill set that we have and we feel comfortable with, where these folks, you know, they may be, you may MI them one day and their ambivalence might shift dramatically the next because they don't have that sort of integrative conception of the world, or unfortunately even themselves at that point. So which is why I wrote the book. Because we need to understand that, because we want
to answer the question.
Yeah, the cognitive behavioral piece of things, which is great. And if you're not a trained therapist, but the only professional in a lot of these folks' lives, that's the tool you have. So that's the tool you're going to use. And when we think it doesn't work, we think either there's something wrong with us and or something wrong with the person we're working with. And again, it's a tool in the belt, but the wrong tool at times for people that are struggling to integrate key pieces of themselves into their reality. The question I'd like to throw back to both of you, and more of an observation, I'd like to get your responses, because what really worries me about, you know, children, but also adults who disassociate is, and I know there's a range of disassociations, but on one hand, especially when I work with schools, these aren't necessarily the kids that make our radar in the same way the fight or flight kids do. You know, in some ways, it's great if a kid keeps going to the principal's office, because that's the kid we need to ask, is trauma having some effects on their behavior? Those are somewhat, you know, give me your behavioral problems. You can list off your top 5, and we can start asking those trauma-informed questions about them. I worry, like Kurt described, the kid checking out, the kid that isn't motivated. When I think back to, and I don't think this is everybody who does this by any stretch, but my high school, middle school experience, there was this group of kids who always seemed to have their head buried in a book. In the hallways, in the classrooms, they were never reading the book that the teacher was, but they'd be reading like War and Peace or something. It wasn't like they were reading a comic book. And so on one hand, these kids are maybe a lot of times flying under the radar. And then on the other hand, when I've seen extreme cases on this, including people that I felt confident diagnosing a dissociative personality disorder, which means we see these extreme shifts, is these people often get labeled especially from those outside the profession, as just crazy, because there's no way to put these in any kind of logical box that we can do. I remember, I'll share one of my big shortcomings as a therapist once. I was running a school, and we had a girl that when she got triggered, the most extreme case of dissociation I've ever seen, her hair texture would change, and her eye color would change, and her skin tone would change. And it was a bad coincidence that I also watched the documentary about The Exorcist at the same time. So my best clinical explanation is she had a demon in her, because I had no other way to explain the behavior. I then took a breath and went back to the DSM and found some better scientific explanations. But I kind of wonder your guys' experience as well. Is, you know, I'm afraid we're just failing as sort of a society. These people that exist on either of these extremes, they're either not making our radar in the same way, or we just put the crazy label on them and kind of give up on them in some ways. And I just kind of want to, if you've had some of the similar experiences and how you've helped people work around that as well.
Well, you know, what Jerry had described about going into a treatment center and asking, do you have dissociation here? And the answer, no, we really don't, can easily also be explained by, we have enough aggression to keep us busy.
Yeah.
we don't have time to pay attention to dissociation.
Yeah.
It's easier that
Yes.
you not right in your face to have to deal with it. So it makes some pretty good functional sense.
Yeah.
But I think that your point is really well taken, that we have it a lot.
Yeah.
Probably much more than we identify, which certainly is a great reason why having good clinical accountability models is really important, where we do lots of screening and where we do information gathering from a very systematic standpoint, where we ask the right questions every single time, no matter what.
Yeah.
Follow a process to gather information in an effective way. I think those are some of the best ways to get it into the radar, or onto the radar, is just asking about it and making sure that as an organization or as a program, or as an individual, we ask about it a lot, and at least put it on something that we'll be able to look at in a treatment team meeting, or when we're writing a treatment plan or engaging with a client, that we ask about it and keep it on our radar. But certainly I've seen it a lot.
Yeah.
You know, a couple of thoughts is, there's a very high correlation between individuals with a disorganized attachment and later on use of dissociation as a coping strategy, right? And so when we go back to our podcast on attachment, is really understanding this: when our caretakers were frightening or frightened and weren't available to us, it left us with overwhelming internal experiences that we didn't have the capacity to manage.
Yeah.
And so we had to develop strategies to manage those. And oftentimes you begin to see a historical context to some of this when we begin to look at some of that. So I think that's an important thing to understand, is that there's a very big difference between somebody who had a really healthy relational experiences and then was thrown into an overwhelming kind of sense of helplessness and powerlessness. When they come out, even though they may have pieces of themselves that have fragmented, they have the ability to make use of relationships again. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes what we see is the combination of individuals who had to rely on dissociation, but didn't have the capacity to feel safe and secure in relationships as well, which makes it very, very difficult to be able to manage that. And in a way, I think a lot of what happens in these treatment centers is you have individuals who get overwhelmed, and they both, they get into their fight self, or they get into their wanting to run away and kind of do it, but they can't really make use of the relationship. And so you end up dealing with the aggression, and you're dealing with the behavior and not really understanding the context of what that's in, because it's a reenactment for them as opposed to a health and recovery process with this stuff. So, I think that's a really important to both look at the behavior you're seeing, but understand it in a whole life experience of what kind of led up to somebody being in this kind of place. And always asking that question of, instead of what's wrong with this person, what might have happened to this person, and why is this person relying on this kind of style to cope with what's going on in their lives, right? We have a multitude of options. It's not just by accident that this is the high probability that this keeps coming up. There's something that's going on to make this type of coping strategy a more probable solution to their problems. And it's based on their, as Kurt would say, their learning history, to kind of looking at that in relationships and in the world, kind of thinking about some of those things. So I think, Matt, what you're really looking at, your first explanation was this pull of, what do I do with this?
Yeah.
How do I make sense of this crazy person in front of me, right? And when you step back, really, you began to say is, so I wonder why this person is beginning to behave this way, right? Very different lens to look at the problem.
Yes.
Very different understanding. And it also, if you think about the relationship, when I think you're crazy or you're unmotivated or you're doing it, there's a rupture in the relationship. When I begin to be open and curious about what might be going on with you, I kind of open that door to this relational connection. We're going back to your book, this connectedness, kind of looking at the kind of thinking about that. So, I think that we've got to, in all of these things, is how do we stop and understand that when somebody is fragmented, it creates a distress in us.
Yeah.
We first have to manage our own distress, and then we have to become open and curious to what might be going on with that individual. Why is this person in my office or in my classroom yesterday that was compliant and today is cussing at me and screaming at me and doing, what's happening inside of that child that they're in a very different state today than they were yesterday? Yeah. That's the question I ask. I don't necessarily have an answer for that, but I begin to ask a different question. And then what intervention could I make that could kind of hold both sides of this kid? You know what? Being overly compliant probably isn't a good place for this kid, but being overly aggressive isn't a good place for this. How do I begin to kind of create a space but I've got to hold both of those parts of that individual to be able to kind of do that. So I think what we talk about, Sandra Bloom talks about, is how do we move away from behavior management to more clinical or therapeutic thinking about why this individual is doing what they're doing. And when we change our question, it opens up different ways for us to intervene and interact.
Great. Kurt, we're about up against the time, but I want to see if you have any other kind of closing thoughts for us or reflections on another real simple topic in the trauma-informed paradigm we're covering today.
Yeah, while Jerry was talking, I was thinking back on the example I gave about my experience as an early leader, having to dissociate from my role in difficult decisions. And that was kind of something, Jerry, you were just talking about, is trying to stay engaged with the person and understand that person and stay curious in that person, how difficult that really is. That is because the dissociation, or me saying, I don't care, is a way for me to dissociate from the pain of hearing from others about how this decision that I may have made hurt them or caused a problem for them. The other side of that is, if you're going to make the decision to say, I do care and I do care deeply, that means that you're going to have to stay engaged with somebody else's pain. And that is a real challenge. And so it sounds great, but it's real hard. And I think as we think about that and think about how we need to take care of each other when we're doing this work together, how our organizations need to be designed with the idea in mind that people are going to need a lot of support to stay engaged with people who are going through pain, I think are a couple of things that pop into my head of supporting how much effort and how much energy it takes to stay engaged with somebody who's experiencing pain.
Great point. And I you know, just to sort of wrap us up here, again, it's the complexity of all this, and the real need for us to be in a place professionally and personally to be able to step back and say, okay, what's really going on here? And again, disassociation can show up as unmotivation, withdrawal, sort of in some ways I've seen it as depression. We can put those labels on it, or to the extreme of crazy. And what in the world is happening? I have a whole different person in front of me than I had in front of me 5-10 minutes ago, or even yesterday. And so it just, again, hopefully gives you as our listeners another way to step back and say, okay, is this potentially, is trauma, where all this comes from, a real potential cause of this behavior as it rises to the surface? And again, if you can identify that, for some of you, it may guide your treatment if you're in that role. For others, you know, I think we'd all probably support that this may mean trying to get somebody in to get a psychological eval or other diagnostic thing where we could say, okay, yeah, this is happening, because that would hopefully direct some services they could get later on as well. And the thing that hopefully we'll stop doing is punishing people for having these behaviors when they're really just coping mechanisms that, again, as we say a million times already in our podcast, that really help them survive at one point in their life through a hellish experience. So great episode, guys. And I just want to point out here that this is our last episode. We're sort of, when this gets published, we'll be right up against Christmas. Hanukkah will be in there. And so we'd like to just wish everybody happy holidays, whatever you celebrate. Hopefully have a good time. Take care of yourself. Again, I always like to point out, a lot of us in the field of the helping professions don't necessarily we have to work on Christmas and New Year's and all those as well. So just a shout out to everybody, really take care of themselves, and to have a great holiday as well. So Kurt, Jerry, happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, and everything else to you all. And
just remember that the best present is your presence.
Kurt, we can't top that. So with that, thank you for joining us for the Trauma Informed Lens podcast, aka Jerry's Wisdom. You can find show notes. We'll put some links. We'll definitely put some of the links to the Elizabeth Smart stuff. She's created her own foundation as well. If you're interested, if you don't know her story, the documentary, I believe, was on A&E. Worth checking out if you can check that out. And we'll put all that at traumainformedlens.org, as well as videos if you want to see our smiling faces in person. So thanks, everybody, for listening. Again, take care of yourselves over the holidays, and we'll keep coming to you every week. So take care of yourselves. Thank you.